The Beauty of a Scar by Elim Gebrehiwot. I lay trembling in my hard bed, partly from fear and partly from the cold that rattled the marrows of my bones. The previously peaceful and softly twinkling night was now filled with wild, vicious flames that licked up everything in its path. The window framed the view of thick gas and blazing streaks that illuminated the imposing rocky landscape behind. The image would have been breathtaking if it had been in another circumstance. Billows of smoke obscured the horizon, and I could only imagine what the shouts and screams of the people meant, and what they were experiencing in the fiery hell a few hundred meters away. My eyes flashed wide open, and I felt little ants and cold fingertips crawling all over my body. The warm sheets burrowed themselves in the deep, rugged scars across my back, and I ran my fingers along them gingerly. I got up and cautiously walked to the large window, as if landmines were about to explode under my feet and obliterate me into a million pieces. The dawning sky greeted me with purple and orange streaks, but did not even have a trace of smoke. So I crawled back into my still warm bed, relieved but also shaking. I tried to block out the sounds of crackling wood and the screams that echoed in my head, but after a few moments I realized that I would never be able to get back to sleep. I heaved myself out of bed again and decided to go make myself a cup of tea. I knew it wouldn't, but I hoped a hot drink would soothe my restless mind. I paused in the doorway of the room along the hall and watched the charming girl sleeping in her bed. My heart was filled with love for my niece that was dropped into my arms as a tiny baby. I could only hope her dreams weren't as petrifying as mine were. As if sensing I was there, she turned around, opened her wide, chocolate brown eyes. Her innocent face gave me a tired smile as she sat up onto her elbows. "What are you doing up so late, Auntie?" "Shouldn't you be sleeping?" she asked, yawning. I walked over and sat on the edge of her bed. "You mean, what am I doing up so early? It's only around 3 in the morning, I said eerily. She giggled and dropped her curly head back onto her pillow. "Good morning then, Auntie. I think I'll sleep for a bit longer, though." I stroked her dark plaits and her eyes drooped close before I could answer. I shuffled back along the passageway, careful not to creak the gleaming wooden floorboards. I breathed in deeply, inhaling the scent of cinnamon and other spices that lingered in the air of the kitchen. I ran my hand against the smooth, clean surface of the counter and letting it cool my hot fingers. After I'd poured myself boiling water and added lemon and honey into the cup, I walked to the living room and sank into the armchair next to a large window, looking out onto the flowery front garden and silent streets. I was afraid to close my eyes, lest the nightmares all came rushing back to me. But surprisingly, I found comfort in the warmth of the tea, seeping into my quivering body, and the fact that I had an angel a few meters away. The next day, after I dropped off my niece at school, I drove over to one of my 2 jobs. After my morning shift at the local supermarket, I went for my afternoon shift at an Italian restaurant downtown. Before picking my niece up from her after-school activities, it was the usual busy day. My back and hands were aching and sore, but I knew it was all for a good reason. I pulled up at the school, and my niece got in silently, mumbling a miserable greeting without even looking up. I studied her face curiously. She was usually smiling and happy after school, but I decided to leave her alone and bring about a cheery mood myself. In no time, I had her clutching her stomach and cackling like a hyena from the drama and the conversations I picked up from the supermarket and restaurant I worked at. On one occasion, as 2 cashiers were talking, one of the ladies grew so frustrated as she ranted about her house problems that she started calling her mother-in-law wicked, vicious, and diabolical, just as an elderly female customer walked into the lane, and the customer thought she was bad-mouthing her. I grinned because this was one of the precious moments that would stay in my memories, one that would bring a smile to my lips instead of haunting me in the night. My niece stomped straight to her room. Her giggling and laughter wiped away from her face as soon as I parked our Toyota Yaris on the street in front of our single-story house. I was so surprised that my keys nearly tumbled out of my hand. I started worrying, my mind bringing up all kinds of horrible stories to explain her strange moods. I wondered if I was the cause for this, and whether my negative thoughts and flashbacks were affecting her even if she didn't know about them. But I told my racing heart to calm down and passed it off as just a bad day or pressure from schoolwork. I strolled into the kitchen, planning the meal I would make for dinner before leaving for my evening shift at the restaurant again. In a few hours she had come out of her shell, following the scent of lasagna wafting from the oven and helping me set the table and lay down the food. We chatted happily. However, when I asked her about school, she went quiet and looked down at her plate. It's going good. My niece couldn't lie. I questioned her about her subjects, friends, teachers, but all I got was yes, no, and I don't know. After a while, the only noise that could be heard was the clatter of knives and forks against the plates. I took a deep breath and broke the silence with a question I'd been bursting to ask. Look at me, honey, I said, and her wide eyes did what I asked. You would tell me if anything at all was wrong, right? Even me, I asked gently. She looked back down at her plate guiltily, her cheeks blushing. Yes, Auntie, you haven't done anything though. Her tone implied that she expected a reply, but my mind was already far away, pondering the questions that popped up in my mind. After we were finished eating, she got up and glanced at me from under her dark eyelashes. Thanks for the food, Auntie. It was really nice. Yes, no problem, I replied softly, getting up to clear the table. After I got myself ready, I said goodbye to my niece and left for my shift. It was so busy that night that I had to stay an extra hour to help the rest of the young staff members. When I came back home, the moon had bathed my garden with a silvery light so that even the dullest of objects shone and shimmered with an entrancing light. The shimmering moonlight exposed the ashy ground, littered with debris and piles of smouldering wood and broken mud bricks. The sickening smell of rotten and burnt flesh lingered in the air and filled my nostrils. If you looked hard enough, you would be able to see the unfortunate souls that were unable to escape the wrath of what had rained down mercilessly. The weapons that were seen as a fantasy, stories previously used to scare children, or an around-the-fire grandfather's tale, were now our stark reality and wiped out whole families in one go. As I looked ahead of the group I was traveling with, I saw the vast green land down below, now twinkling merrily with small golden lights. If only they knew, I said to myself. Even if they did know, they wouldn't do a thing. The girl walking beside me remarked bitterly. Behind me, the tall mountains towered over us, and it felt like our every move was being watched by cruel, dark eyes. Under the golden sunlight of day, the mountain rang with song and laughter, even though it was a difficult climb, and the green grass and flowers danced in the whistling wind. In the middle of the night, however, the rocks seemed sharp and spiky, and regularly used wide paths appeared dangerously narrow. The silvery light bathed the previously unnoticeable crooks and crannies with an eerie light, and emphasized the dingy smoke lazily crawling its way up the mountain. The air was so stuffed with heat and tension, it was not able to stir even a single strand of hair on my head. My heart jumped into my mouth when the sound of crackling broke the glooming silence. I looked down to find crushed white powder and pieces of blackened bone under my foot. I froze and put my hand over my mouth lest all the contents of my stomach flew out. I tried to imagine who the miserable remains of the body could have belonged to, and the combination of anger and grief coursing through me felt like a spider crawling down my back. I blinked my eyes as a cold wind rolled over my body and sent a shudder down my spine. The previously magical moonlight didn't seem so friendly anymore, and I hastily closed the door behind me. My trembling fingers struggled to turn the key in the lock. I knew it was only my heart that was pounding, but it felt like an earthquake was rattling the entire neighborhood. After I'd showered, I peeked through my niece's bedroom to check if she was sleeping. She was, with an open book still in her hand and her phone next to her pillow. As I tiptoed to her bed and leaned down to kiss her goodnight on her forehead, I noticed the phone was opened on a chat. It was from a girl from school, and I had to rub my eyes to make myself believe that a child could have such hatred and racism flowing from her mouth. My heart was filled with pure anger and then helplessness, and I realized what this could mean. All of my hopes and efforts of protecting my niece from the cruelties of this world were shattered. It took all the emotional strength I could muster to keep tears from exploding from my face. I scrolled through the messages, my eyes widening with each swipe of my finger. My poor girl was being bullied, and that was the truth I had to face. My body suddenly felt like a limp rag that had been wrung too many times. I decided to delete the hostile girl's contact on my niece's phone. I rubbed my wrinkled forehead wearily, and things slowly started to click into place in the complicated puzzle I had in my brain. I gazed at my niece's face and wished that the bitterness of this world wouldn't reach her. However, I knew that it would, either sooner or later, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I stumbled to my bedroom and collapsed into my bed. I could feel every year of my life in my fatigued bones, and despite the thoughts spinning vigorously in my head, my eyes closed almost instantly, and I fell into a fitful slumber. My elder brother came rushing into my room and shook me roughly. My eyes blinked open tiredly, and when I grumbled and tried to turn around, his strong arms held me back. "Get up! There's fire outside and people are in trouble. I'm not joking. Listen!" He shouted at me. In the distance, I could hear crashes and screams. "It's just like the stories," my brother said gravely. We made eye contact and jumped to our feet simultaneously. As soon as my feet hit the cold wooden floors, they started running. My brother followed behind me. My 8-year-old sister was already in the kitchen, packing our few possessions and food. Her hands flew around the room, her young face so determined and serious that I would have laughed out loud if it was not for the situation. I hastily put on my shoes and flew out the house, passing my parents who were trying to gather as many edible vegetables, fruit and grain as fast as their hard-working hands could go. My feet carried me swiftly through the field that separated our house from the main village, while the long green stalks whipped my face and the wind whistled through my hair. When I finally reached the end of the field, I froze in my tracks. I'd rushed out of a cool green field only to step into a fiery hell. Dark smoke filled the air, and even the tiniest strips of moonlight were consumed by its swirly depths. Blood-chilling screams rang in my ears, and the sight of crackling wood and murderous flames was reflecting in my eyes. Every gentle blow of the wind pushed the rising inferno to even greater heights, and when my jaw could not drop any lower, I noticed the small grey aircrafts hovering around in the sky. A metal object that gleamed in the blazing light dropped from one of them, and I followed it down before it made an impact with the village square. Everything within a 100-meter radius was completely obliterated and blasted from its place. What I could only describe as a holocaust was happening right before my glassy eyes. I snapped back to my senses and took a deep breath before deciding to help the people who were sprinting back and forth from the combustion and beating the flames off the terrified victims. Holding my t-shirt over my nose and my mouth, I sprinted to the house closest to the killing machine and kicked the burning door open. I found a young mother and her baby sleeping peacefully in their beds, before shaking the mother awake roughly and lifting the baby into my arms. The poor woman was confused, but was roused to action as soon as I pointed out the window. She sped around the house, gathering as much as she could. I led her to safety beyond the village's blazing flames. The impossible task of saving all the village people towered in front of me. We were trained for this kind of emergency at school, and getting as many people as possible out of harm's way was the first priority. Even the ones coming to help from the outskirts would not reach in time if the merciless grey plains and relentless fire continued this way. The larger towns and cities further away would not move their rich backsides from their luxury sofas, even if they would reach in time. Many families have been caught by surprise and were still in their pleasant dreams, unaware of the chaos outside. Soon I had to dodge flying pieces of charred wood, and I did not dare to look down at what was making the crushing sounds beneath my feet. The village square was already past the point of no return, and I had to jump over the blackened bodies and scorched doors to get to what could be saved behind. My heartbeat roared in my ears so loudly that I nearly missed the thud of a heavy metal bomb behind me. I barely had time to jump behind a collapsing wooden wall and bury the toddler that I was carrying under my body, before I was blasted against the hot sparks and ashes in front of me. I shielded the child from the explosion and sharp pieces of burning debris slammed against my back. Before my mind could comprehend the excruciating pain I was feeling, blackness filled my vision, and I passed out. I sat up in bed, with my chest heaving rapidly, and my hand instantly went to my side, fingering the deep scars that were spread along my whole back. My mind was reeling from the memories that had flooded my unexpecting brain, and I almost expected to taste blood in my mouth and feel blisters on my fingertips. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, calming my frantic thoughts before I started to get ready for the day. The nasty text messages came rushing back to me, and I worried about how things would turn out at school. My niece was in a dreary morning mood. I was overthinking and analyzing even the simplest words or facial expressions. During the whole afternoon, that was all I could think about, but the shock that came afterwards was something I would not have dreamed up in 100 years. I sat in the car, waiting for my niece to finish school. I had already waited for 20 minutes and was peering anxiously at every moving creature in sight through the passenger window. A few teachers and students staggered out of the deserted buildings, and I could not help but stare at a particular seemingly depressed child walking out dejectedly. His head was hanging down sadly, and his uniform was muddy and tattered. He was fast walking, however, as if trying to escape what was behind him, and I could see cuts and dark bruises flowering in colors on his skin. The child was heading straight towards me, and it seemed peculiar before something appeared familiar about him. In a click, I realized that it was actually a girl. My niece. It felt like icy cold shrapnel had pierced my heart. My battered teenage niece got into the car, and looking closely, I could see that some of her long plaits had been sawed off roughly, and odd coily strands popped out. I lifted her face up with quivering hands and had a sharp intake of breath when I saw the flaming red marks across her smooth, brown skin. Her eyes were full to overflowing with tears, and her bottom lip cracked and bleeding. "What in the world happened?" I asked, flabbergasted. She looked back down at the streaks of dirt and rips on her leggings shamefully, and her voice sounded weak when she answered. "I just tripped, that's all," she answered pathetically. I do not know if my eyes or expression had hardened, but she flinched when she looked up at me and spilled all of what happened at once. Apparently there was a group of girls at school who repeatedly made fun of my niece's dark complexion and African hair. They always told her that she should straighten her hair if she wanted to be as good as them, and told her to go back to being a slave because that was all she would be good at. My niece would always try to ignore them, but today after school the group confronted her in the bathroom. Before she could continue, she broke down into a sobbing, dirty mess, and my heart broke for her. I did not go to work that evening, and my niece and I sat on the couch with our fingers wrapped around steaming mugs of hot chocolate. She was cleaned up and calmed down a little bit after her breakdown that afternoon. I knew that our budget did not allow for the expense of moving to a new school, and talking to the headmaster would not help since the group of girls' parents supported the school financially, as my niece told me. However, many times I tried to convince myself that there was another solution. At the end of the day, I could not deny that my niece would simply have to cope with the problem, and that the only way was to somehow make her stronger. I glanced at her thoughtful, bruised face, a reflection of myself when I was an early teenager. I took a deep breath before revealing my secret. What I had been ashamed of ever since the invasion of my village, the horrible day I obtained my scars. My niece's eyes expanded in surprise after I told her my story, and she ran her fingers along the bumpy indents across my back. Her soft eyes seemed to harden in determination, and I knew that an irreplaceable innocence had been lost. She threw herself into me, and I hugged her, stroking her hair gently. I enfolded her in my arms firmly, her frail body pressed against mine, reminding me of another little body, some 50 years ago.